On June 20th, 1944, one of the decisive engagements of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, was underway but not yet decided. The previous day, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile force had been badly mauled. The Japanese fleet had lost 2 carriers to U.S. submarines, and 303 planes had failed to return from the airstrike that Ozawa had hoped would annihilate Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher's Task Force 58. During the night, Ozawa's remaining ships headed north, away from the American carrier fleet. Transferring his flag to the fleet carrier Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor operation, Ozawa made plans to take his ships out of aircraft range, refuel them, and then go back into action. Although his superior, Admiral Suemo Toyota, advised against another attack, Ozawa believed he still had a good chance of winning. Undaunted, Ozawa vowed to crush the American fleet on June 21st and end the invasion of the Marianas Islands once and for all. But Task Force 58 beat him to the punch. On June 20th, the U.S. Navy's carrier pilots ended his hope for victory. It happened because Mitscher took the initiative to pursue the retreating foe. He did not want to play defense for a second day in a row. All morning and all afternoon, he ordered his scout planes to scour the wide, empty Philippine Sea. At 1:30 p.m., one of Mitscher's carriers, USS Enterprise, launched a search mission consisting of 8 TBF Avengers and 4 Hellcats. 2 hours and 10 minutes after takeoff, and after crossing some 325 miles of ocean, Lieutenant Bob Nelson of Torpedo Squadron 10 saw a small ripple on the horizon, just to the left side of his engine cowl. Curious about its identity, he signaled to his wingman and went to investigate. Climbing to 3,000 feet, Nelson cautiously approached. At 3:15, the mighty Japanese Navy came into view 10 miles away. Jackpot! When he could see the ships clearly, Lieutenant Nelson broke radio silence and delivered his contact report, sending his messages over radio and through Morse code. Unfortunately, because of foul weather and because of the tremendous distance over which Nelson transmitted, it took a full 15 minutes before anyone with Task Force 58 could hear or decipher the young pilot's entire message. During that time, Japanese crewmen on the cruiser Otago intercepted Nelson's transmission and reported it to Ozawa. Realizing his fleet had been spotted, he ordered the refueling operation to cease, and he advised all ships to head northwest away from the Americans at 24 knots. Nelson's contact report, which had to be corrected by his wingman, finally reached Mark Mitscher's flagship at 4:05 p.m. Mitscher had a difficult choice to make. Nelson's report placed the Japanese fleet at 275 miles away, and less than 4 hours of daylight remained. Was it even possible to send out a strike over so great an expanse and so late in the day? For a few minutes, Mitscher agonized over the decision.
Taking advantage of this opportunity to destroy the Japanese fleet was going to cost us a great deal in planes and pilots because we are launching at the maximum range of our aircraft at such a time that it would be necessary to recover after dark. This meant all carriers would be recovering daylight-trained air groups at night, with consequent loss of some pilots who were not familiar with night landings and who would be fatigued at the end of an extremely hazardous and long mission.
But the lure of the Japanese carriers was too tempting to pass up. Turning to his staff, Mitscher commanded, "Launch the first deck loads as soon as possible. Get the carriers." Down in the ready rooms, the yeomen took Mitscher's message and scrawled it on the chalkboards. After a whole day of waiting, the pilots suddenly learned that they had a mission to accomplish. On 11 different carriers, the pilots dashed onto the flight deck, mounted their planes, and started their engines. At 4:41 p.m., the carriers turned into the wind, launching the airstrike. With haste, they made their way toward the setting sun, hoping to catch up with their quarry before night closed the scene. Among the swarm of planes, Lieutenant Harold Buell of Bombing Squadron 2 piloted a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. As he took to the skies, Buell pondered the danger of this evening assignment.
From a purely personal viewpoint, I've always thought that the most amazing thing about this mission was that it ever took place at all. Almost all the pilots leaving the carriers, certainly all the flight leaders, knew they were going beyond normal gas range to hit the enemy. If the Japanese had made such a strike against our fleet, we would dub it a suicide mission. But when U.S. leaders launched us on June 20, 1944, it was considered an acceptable risk. It was, of course, much more than that, and the terrible losses in aircraft that resulted marked this as the costliest single mission in naval aviation history, except perhaps for the Battle of Midway. Yet, almost to a man, we went on the mission as ordered, knowing that our chances of a safe return to a flight deck were, at best, severely limited. These young men departed with an eagerness to engage with the enemy and to hell with the consequences. Unlike the Japanese foe, these Americans loved life and lived it to the hilt. There were no thoughts of suicide or harakiri, only a deep desire to take part in the big one, to win at all costs. The men who flew into the sunset on June 20, 1944, were perpetuating all those treasured traditions of the first naval aviators.
After more than 2 hours in the air, the airstrike caught up with Ozawa's fleet. The pilots sighted a cluster of 6 oilers chugging along at the end of the Japanese column. The dive bomber group from USS Wasp, the flight with the least amount of fuel, went into the attack. They damaged 2 of the oilers so badly that the Japanese were forced to scuttle them. Meanwhile, the U.S. fighter planes tore into Ozawa's combat air patrol craft, overwhelming them. The airstrike's 95 F-6F Hellcat fighters tore through the Japanese, and in the ensuing dogfight, the Japanese lost 65 fighter planes. With these Japanese fighters out of the way, the dive bombers and torpedo bombers charged for the center of the Japanese task force, where the aircraft carriers were located. The American pilots could see 7 of them. Maneuvering to their attack altitudes, the squadrons dispersed, doing their best to hit as many carriers as they could simultaneously. At low altitude, Lieutenant George Brown of Torpedo Squadron 24 charged at the carrier Hiyo, alongside 7 other torpedo bombers. The Hiyo and its escort ships unleashed a hail of AA fire at the TBMs as they skimmed above the water. Leading the pack, Brown's plane was struck by AA and it caught on fire. His 2 gunners bailed out, but Brown stayed in the flaming cockpit, pushed his plane through the flak, and dropped his torpedo, which detonated against Hiyo's starboard side. The torpedo destroyed the carrier's starboard engine room and reduced its speed. Meanwhile, dive bombers from bombing squadrons 10 and 16 struck from above, putting 2 bombs into the carrier, one of which detonated atop the bridge, killing the command crew. 2 hours later, after the damage control crews failed to contain the spreading flames, Hiyo exploded when leaking gasoline vapor connected with the fires below decks. With that, Hiyo sank stern first, taking 247 sailors to a watery grave. Lieutenant Brown, the torpedo pilot who had likely delivered the mortal blow, was never seen again. After the battle, he received a posthumous Navy Cross. The American pilots went after the other carriers just as aggressively. Chiyoda received a bomb hit, killing 20 men. Junyo took 2 hits from American bombers, and Ryuho suffered damage from several near misses. But the pilots hungered for Zuikaku, the last carrier that had been involved in the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. Dive bombers from USS Hornet saw it turning in tight circles, and they gave it a pounding. Leading a division of 6 dive bombers, Lieutenant Harold Buell requested permission to make the first diving attack on Zuikaku. His air group commander replied, "Go ahead, Hal. Show them how it's done." Thrusting his plane's stick forward, Buell dived straight down at 80 degrees from 20,000 feet. Buell remembered the exciting descent.
Words cannot describe the AA fire that began coming up from the huge circular Japanese task force formation of 11 ships as my Helldiver group moved into a position for our dives. In the lead plane, I was a focal point. With the massive shells passing all about me, I felt like I was diving into an Iowa Plains hellstorm. I had never encountered so much flak. My dive brakes were already open, and I was well into a good dive, but because of the potent defensive fire, I felt like I was moving in slow motion in quicksand. I would never make it. At this point, I did something I had never done before in a dive. I closed my dive brakes. My plane responded by dropping like a stone towards the target below, leaving the heavy AA fire behind. So much for that problem, but now I had another, more serious one. My speed was building up, and in the condition without flaps, I could never expect to pull the plane out of the dive after firing my bomb. Shouting a prayer to my guardian angel, at 6,000 feet, I placed my dive brake selector back into the open position. The wing dive brakes did what no manufacturing specs said they would. They opened. It was as if a giant hand grabbed my plane by the tail. My headlong plunge slowed, and there was the enemy carrier dead in my sight below, turning into my flight path along its lengthwise axis. At point-blank range of 2,000 feet, I fired my bombs.
One after another, Buell's pilots released their 1,000-pound bombs. 2 or 3 of them made contact with Zuikaku's flight deck, starting tremendous fires. Yorktown's air group followed, adding 4 or 5 more hits. The leader of the dive, Lieutenant Buell, nearly died in the process. Just as his dive bomber leveled off, an AA shell burst directly underneath his starboard wing, blasting a flaming hole right through it. A large shell fragment passed through the cockpit, slicing across Buell's back from his right rib cage to his left shoulder. The shell tore open his flight suit and severed his parachute rigging as if it had been cut by a straight razor. A second, bullet-sized piece of shell bored its way into Buell's back, causing him searing pain. He cried into the intercom, "Oh God, I've been hit bad." Wafting only 100 feet above the water, with his plane's right wing on fire, Buell sped over the ring of escort destroyers which continued to fill the air with shells. Before he could check his injuries, he had to deal with his damaged wing. The fire had burned a hole 1 foot in diameter, and as he flew along, that hole grew larger with each passing second. The edges of the aperture burned white hot, which meant that airflow over the wing was causing the flames to spread. In desperation, he decided to cut his power, reducing his plane's speed. Before stalling out, Buell throttled up again. He did this over and over, reducing the airflow and choking off the fire. Of course, this technique grew harder as the hole got larger, and he wore out his arms just keeping the plane level. Finally, while cruising at a paltry 125 knots, the fire snuffed out. With that, Buell took stock of his condition.
With the fire out, and the plane on a homeward heading and still flying, I could now think for myself. How bad was I wounded? I was feeling little actual pain and was not dizzy or faint, but that could be because my body was still running on natural adrenaline from the excitement of the attack. Reaching behind with my left hand, I felt my lower back. It was wet and sticky. My hand came away, covered with blood. While there was a considerable amount of it, I realized that the wound must not be a serious one, as I was not feeling weak or having the kind of pain that a major one would cause. Apparently, it was something that I could live with. Setting my feet firmly on the cockpit deck, I unbuckled the seatbelt and shoulder harness and raised myself up from the aircraft seat. The result of this action was that the severed parachute backpack and harness fell away. There would be no bailing out. Any emergency would mean a water landing.
Of the 226 U.S. planes sent on the June 20th mission, 20 had been shot down. Dozens of other pilots were in Buell's situation, flying battle-damaged aircraft back to the fleet. As they headed east into darkness, they left behind a wrecked Japanese task force. 1 fleet carrier and 2 oilers were about to sink, and 3 other carriers had taken non-fatal hits. It was not the decisive, fleet-destroying blow that Mitscher had envisioned, but it ended the Japanese threat to the Marianas. The real question remained: would Mitscher's aviators make it back home before their fuel ran out? If Task Force 58 failed to recover the bulk of their pilots, the long-term success of Operation Forager would be in peril. Fifth Fleet needed its aviators for the rest of the operation. If they all perished on June 20th, would the Americans have to surrender the Marianas by default? Although the last shots of the engagement had now been fired, the gripping drama of the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not yet over.